On October 14, 1943, nearly 300 B-17 flying fortresses climbed slowly into the frozen skies over occupied Europe. Their destination was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Inside those aircraft were almost 3,000 American airmen, young men who understood exactly what awaited them. This was not the first time the 8th Air Force had attacked Schweinfurt. 2 months earlier, another force had flown the same route and suffered catastrophic losses. 36 bombers had been shot down. Hundreds of men had been killed or captured. Survivors returned with stories that sounded unbelievable, German fighters attacking in waves so relentless that some crews had exhausted their ammunition before even reaching the target. They described enemy aircraft lining up in the distance, waiting their turn to make firing passes, as if queuing at a toll booth. Schweinfurt mattered. Its factories produced ball bearings, small components without which modern warfare could not function. Tanks required them. Aircraft engines required them. Submarines required them. American planners believed that destroying Schweinfurt would cripple German war production. The cost, no matter how high, was considered acceptable. Now they were going back. The crews knew the odds. They had seen the empty bunks left behind after the first raid. They had attended memorial services for men who had been laughing at breakfast and were dead by dinner. They knew that daylight bombing without long-range fighter escort meant facing the full strength of the Luftwaffe. And yet, they climbed aboard their aircraft anyway. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside those bombers dropped to nearly 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside, it was scarcely warmer. The B-17 had no pressurization and no real heating system. Its thin aluminum skin conducted cold directly into the crew compartments. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Breath froze on oxygen masks. Bare metal became so cold that touching it meant instant frostbite. Some men suffered more than others. Waist gunners stood at open windows, exposed to a 200-mile-per-hour slipstream of Arctic air. Even with electrically heated suits and multiple layers of clothing, they were fighting physics itself. Wind chill at those speeds and temperatures produced conditions the human body could not endure for long. Flesh could freeze in less than a minute. Bull turret gunners had it differently, but no better. Curled inside a small plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, surrounded by cold-conducting metal, they sat with their knees drawn to their chest, hands gripping controls that became blocks of ice. If their heating failed, escape was often impossible. Every man wore an electrically heated flight suit, a one-piece garment threaded with heating wires and plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. On paper, it was supposed to keep crews alive at extreme altitude. In reality, it had a fatal flaw. The wires inside the suit were fragile. They broke easily. When they did, the entire system failed instantly. A man could be warm one moment and freezing the next, with no warning and no way to repair the damage. Over Europe that morning, dozens of these suits failed. German fighters and flak would devastate the formation that day. 60 bombers were shot down. More than 100 were damaged, many beyond repair. Over 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The mission became known as Black Thursday, one of the darkest days in American air warfare. But the survivors did not yet understand something even more disturbing. The cold itself was claiming more victims than German guns. Not dramatically, not visibly, but just as permanently. In the 14 months ending in December 1943, more than 1,600 American airmen were removed from flying duty because of cold injuries sustained on operational missions. During the same period, fewer men were removed due to wounds from enemy action. Frostbite was disabling more airmen than the Luftwaffe. Fingers were lost. Toes were amputated. Careers ended without a single bullet ever touching the body. This is the story of how the United States attempted to defeat German fighters at high altitude and nearly froze its own aircrews to death. It is a story of bureaucratic failure and individual courage, of engineers who never experienced combat designing equipment for men who would die using it, and of one surgeon who refused to accept that good men should continue dying from preventable causes. The problem began years earlier with a fundamental assumption about aerial warfare. When Boeing designed the BR-17 in the mid-1930s, its engineers believed altitude itself would be protection. The bomber could fly higher than most enemy fighters could reach. Anti-aircraft fire would be less accurate. Enemy pilots would struggle in thin air. American doctrine was built around this idea. Heavy bombers would fly in tight formations, their overlapping machine gun fire forming a wall of steel. They would bomb from above the worst of the defenses and return home largely intact. The theory was elegant. The reality was catastrophic. The designers had calculated aircraft performance at altitude, but not human survival. At 25,000 feet, temperatures averaged 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Human flesh freezes in seconds. Metal steels heat instantly. The BR-17 carried 10 men scattered throughout an unheated, unpressurized fuselage. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit, still bitterly cold but relatively protected. Below them, the bombardier and navigator occupied a glass nose with almost no insulation. The flight engineer manned the top turret. The radio operator sat alone amid the fuselage. 2 waist gunners stood exposed at open windows. Beneath them, the ball turret gunner crouched in his sphere. At the tail, another gunner sat completely isolated, surrounded by freezing airflow. Every position was cold. Some were lethal. Waist gunners leaned into Arctic wind while tracking fighters closing at combined speeds of over 500 miles per hour. No clothing could protect against that exposure. Even brief contact caused frostbite. Extended exposure caused permanent injury. The ball turret gunner faced a different nightmare. There was no room for extra clothing, no room for error. If power failed or the turret jammed, escape might be impossible. Many stayed in position even after their heating failed, knowing that abandoning the turret would expose their crew to deadly attacks from below. They kept their hands on frozen controls until landing, when medical staff sometimes had to cut gloves from hands frozen solid. Tail gunners endured isolation so complete that if their oxygen or heating failed, no one could help them. They would freeze alone, unnoticed, until the aircraft landed. By the summer of 1942, when the 8th Air Force arrived in England, it became clear that American aircraft were injuring their own crews before German fighters could. Frostbite cases returned from early missions over France. Men with blackened fingers, white ears, numb feet. Injury severe enough to ground experienced crews. Losses the 8th Air Force could not afford. One man understood immediately that something was wrong. Colonel Malcolm Grow had seen war before. As a young surgeon during World War I, he had volunteered on the Eastern Front, operating under artillery fire in Russia. He had learned what combat did to both men and institutions. Now, as the senior flight surgeon of the 8th Air Force, he recognized a familiar pattern. Men were being sacrificed not by necessity, but by design failure. And he refused to accept it. Colonel Malcolm Grow approached the problem the way a combat surgeon always does, by looking at patterns rather than isolated incidents. Individual cases of frostbite could be dismissed as bad luck or improper procedure. Hundreds of cases, repeating under the same conditions, pointed to systemic failure. Grow reviewed mission reports, medical logs, and casualty statistics. The numbers were unmistakable. Men were freezing despite wearing the protective equipment issued to them. They were following regulations. They were doing everything they had been trained to do, and they were still losing fingers, toes, and careers. The equipment was not working, no matter what the specifications claimed. High-altitude bombing produced injuries unlike anything American military medicine had previously faced. Ground combat wounds were familiar: bullets, shrapnel, burns. Cold injuries were different. Frostbite destroyed tissue silently. Pain came late, often after the damage was already irreversible. A man might complete a mission without realizing that circulation in his fingers had failed hours earlier. By the time the aircraft landed, the damage was done. Medical staff sometimes had to cut gloves off hands frozen into rigid claws. Beneath them, the flesh was white, hard, and lifeless. Some men lost fingers. Others lost entire hands. Many never flew again. Training a bomber crew took months. Building combat experience took longer. Every airman removed from flying duty represented a loss the 8th Air Force could not easily replace. Yet the losses continued. Grow saw that cold injuries were grounding more experienced men than enemy fire. This was not an acceptable trade. Men were being permanently disabled by their own equipment while the enemy benefited without firing a shot. The electrically heated flight suit was supposed to be the solution. The concept dated back to the final year of World War I, when the Army Air Service first experimented with electric heating for pilots flying open-cockpit aircraft. As aircraft climbed higher through the interwar years, electrically heated clothing became standard. By 1941, the F-1 heated flight suit, manufactured by General Electric, had been adopted across the Army Air Forces. It was a one-piece wool garment with heating wires sewn throughout the fabric. Power flowed from the aircraft's electrical system, generating warmth through resistance. When it worked well. When it failed completely. The fatal flaw lay in its wiring. The heating elements were connected in series. Electrical current flowed through every wire in sequence. If even one wire broke, the entire circuit went dead. Heat disappeared instantly, with no warning. The design worked under controlled conditions. It failed under combat. Gunners twisted, crouched, stretched, and scrambled while tracking attacking fighters or clearing jammed weapons. Each movement stressed the fragile wires sewn into the suit. Testing in the American Southwest had not revealed the flaw because test conditions did not replicate combat. Men moved carefully. No one was shooting at them. The suit survived testing. They did not survive war. Grow documented the consequences. Investigations conducted in early 1943 revealed that electrically heated garment failures accounted for roughly 3/4 of frostbite injuries caused by equipment malfunction. The suits were failing faster than they could be replaced. Replacement suits suffered the same flaw. The system itself was broken. Meanwhile, procurement officers insisted the equipment met specifications. Manufacturers pointed to successful testing. Paperwork moved slowly while men continued freezing over Germany. Wind exposure compounded the problem. Waste gunners stood at open windows, exposed directly to the slipstream. At 200 miles per hour, heat was stripped from the body faster than any heating system could replace it. Even a perfectly functioning suit could not compensate for that loss. Wind blast alone accounted for nearly 40% of all frostbite cases by late 1943, a proportion that continued to rise as operations intensified. Physics did not care about regulations or procurement contracts. Another deadly dilemma emerged during combat. 50 caliber machine guns jammed frequently under freezing conditions. Clearing a jam required manipulating metal components with precision. The heavy gloves issued for warmth were too bulky for the task. In combat, with enemy fighters attacking and seconds to act, gunners made a choice. They removed their gloves. Bare skin touched metal chilled to 50 or 60 degrees below zero. 15 seconds could cause permanent injury. 30 seconds could mean amputation. Casualty reports noted violations of procedure. The men were blamed. But everyone who had flown combat knew the truth. The choice was between losing fingers or losing the aircraft. The men did what they had to do. Grow pushed his findings up the chain of command. He requested authority to study the problem systematically. He asked for engineering support to redesign the heating systems. He demanded resources to test equipment under realistic conditions. The response was slow and uneven. Officers far removed from combat debated costs and priorities. Approval chain stretched back to Washington. Requisition stalled. Meanwhile, Frostbite continued to ground crews faster than replacements could arrive. While senior leadership debated, ground crews improvised. Mechanics and crew chiefs saw the injuries firsthand. They watched bombers return with frostbitten men carried off to ambulances. They heard the stories in barracks and mess halls. Master Sergeant Earl Southwick, a crew chief with the 398th Bomb Group, understood the gap between official specifications and operational reality. His job was to keep his aircraft flying, regardless of what the manual said. Depot-level repairs were ignored. Unauthorized modifications were made. If paperwork slowed progress, it was bypassed. Southwick and men like him kept bombers in the air through ingenuity and defiance of procedure. At the squadron level, attempts were made to reduce cold exposure. Extra insulation was added where possible. Electrical connections were reinforced. Heating elements were wrapped to reduce wire breakage. But field expedients could not solve a system-wide design failure. The suits were flawed. The open windows were lethal. The doctrine itself had underestimated the environment. Grow understood that courage and improvisation could not compensate for bad engineering. The solution had to come from redesign, not discipline. The core problem with the heating suits was simple electrical engineering. Wiring the elements in series meant catastrophic failure when a single wire broke. The obvious solution was parallel wiring. In a parallel system, current flows through multiple paths. If one element fails, others continue working. Partial heat is survivable. Total heat loss is not. Grow pushed relentlessly. He worked with engineers, pressured procurement officers, and forced the issue through bureaucratic resistance. In August 1943, a redesigned heated suit was standardized. The F-2 suit abandoned the one-piece design. It used separate jacket and trousers with more flexible wiring connected in parallel. If one section failed, others continued to function. Components could be replaced individually. Without power, the suit provided basic insulation. With power, it could sustain comfort at extreme altitude. It was not perfect, but it was survivable. But equipment alone would not solve the crisis. Manufacturing took time. Distribution took time. Training took time. Until the new systems reached the front, men continued flying in equipment known to fail. Grow knew the crisis was not over. He turned to the aircraft itself. If wind blast was killing gunners, the wind had to be blocked. That realization would change the design of the B-17 forever. The most effective way to stop wind from injuring men was not better clothing, but better aircraft. Colonel Gross' analysis made it clear that no amount of insulation or electric heating could overcome direct exposure to a 200 mph slipstream at Arctic temperatures. If the wind could not be defeated, it had to be blocked. That realization coincided with changes already underway in bomber design. Boeing's B-17G variant, which began entering service in late 1943, incorporated modifications that fundamentally altered crew survivability. Among the most important were enclosed waist gun positions. Instead of standing at open windows, gunners now fired through openings in plexiglass panels that sealed off the slipstream while still allowing full traverse of the weapons. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Frostbite among waist gunners dropped sharply. Men who had previously returned from missions with blackened fingers now returned with injuries no worse than numbness and fatigue. The B-17G also staggered the waist gun positions, placing one gunner slightly forward of the other. This reduced congestion inside the fuselage and minimized tangling of oxygen hoses and electrical cables, a frequent cause of heating suit failures. Small changes in layout produced large gains in safety. The aircraft itself had become part of the solution, not part of the problem. Grow continued attacking the crisis from multiple angles. Improved heated suits were only useful if crews understood how to use them correctly. Training was revised to emphasize cold injury risks and early warning signs. New gloves were developed that balanced insulation with dexterity, allowing gunners to clear jams without removing protection. These gloves were tested under realistic conditions, not in warm laboratories. Face and neck protectors were introduced as hand injuries declined and frostbite migrated to exposed skin. Electrically heated blankets were developed for wounded men whose suits had to be removed during treatment, preventing hypothermia during long return flights. Gross work extended beyond cold injuries. By analyzing wound reports, he discovered that most combat injuries were caused not by bullets but by low-velocity fragments from anti-aircraft shells. He designed lightweight body armor capable of stopping those fragments without restricting movement. The armor saved lives and improved morale. In recognition of his work, Groh was awarded the Legion of Merit in 1943 and the Distinguished Service Medal in 1944. The citations acknowledged his comprehensive approach to crew protection, from heated clothing to wind-blocking equipment and medical evacuation systems. The results were measurable. In early 1943, cold injuries exceeded combat wounds as a cause of crew losses. By late 1943 and into 1944, that relationship reversed. Frostbite cases declined as improved equipment reached the front and training caught up with reality. Hand injuries dropped sharply. Face and air injuries increased proportionally but were less debilitating and often temporary. Most importantly, experienced airmen remained in combat. Crew stayed intact. Formation discipline improved. German intelligence noticed the change. Luftwaffe pilots who had previously encountered sluggish American gunners began facing more accurate defensive fire. Bombers held tighter formations. Aircraft that might once have dropped out of formation due to injured crew members now stayed in position. Not all of this improvement came from equipment. Long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, reduced losses dramatically. Tactical experience also mattered. But part of the improvement came from something simpler. American crews were no longer fighting Frostbite at the same time they were fighting the enemy. The cost of learning those lessons had been brutal. Early crews served as unwilling test subjects. Their injuries defined the limits of human endurance at altitude. Lieutenant John Luckadoo flew B-17s with the 100th Bomb Group, later known as the Bloody 100th because of its staggering casualty rate. The unit flew some of the most dangerous missions of the air war during its deadliest phase. Losses were so severe that other groups avoided flying near them, as if bad luck were contagious. The truth was simpler. The 100th flew deep into Germany before adequate escort was available and paid the price. Luckadoo completed his required missions between mid-1943 and early 1944, surviving when statistics suggested he should not. Decades later, as the last surviving pilot of the original Bloody 100th, he described the four threats every mission faced: fighters, flak, frostbite, and fear. The alliteration captured reality. German defenses were only part of the danger. The environment itself was hostile. Luckadoo recalled landing with his foot frozen to a control pedal, unable to apply brakes normally. Temperatures at altitude reached 50 or 60 degrees below zero. Crew survived on oxygen and luck. The 8th Air Force operated from dozens of bases across eastern England. It flew daylight missions that exposed crews to concentrated enemy defenses. Initially, airmen were required to complete 25 missions to rotate home. During 1942 and 1943, survival odds were grim. 2 out of 3 men would be killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tours. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had suffered more than 40,000 casualties, including over 26,000 dead. The toll exceeded that of entire service branches in other theaters. Cold injuries were a preventable component of that catastrophe. Men were lost because equipment failed, because training was inadequate, and because no one had fully understood how extreme cold would shape combat operations. Training programs in the United States did not prepare crews for European winter conditions. Men trained in Texas and Arizona, where cold was an inconvenience, not a threat. They learned to operate equipment in controlled environments. Then they were sent into skies where temperatures could kill in minutes. Experience filled the training gap, but experience came at a cost. Fingers were lost. Toes were amputated. Careers ended. Only after enough men had been injured did the system change. The lessons learned over Germany reshaped military aviation. When the B-29 Superfortress entered combat over Japan in 1944, it represented a new philosophy. Instead of protecting humans from the environment, it eliminated their exposure entirely. Pressurized cabins maintained survivable temperatures. Gun turrets were remotely operated from inside the aircraft. Crews flew in relative comfort while operating at altitudes that would have killed unprotected men in minutes. That design philosophy persisted. Modern military aircraft are pressurized and climate-controlled. Flight suits focus on G-force protection and emergency ejection, not survival in Arctic cold. The Frostbite crisis taught designers a fundamental truth. Human bodies have limits that training and discipline cannot overcome. Better to engineer those limits out of the system. Colonel Grow continued his career after the war, becoming the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force in 1949. His work saved countless lives and established principles that still guide aerospace medicine. He retired later that year after more than 3 decades of service and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His name lives on in military medical institutions, but his true legacy is less visible. It exists in every pressurized cockpit, every climate-controlled crew station, every piece of equipment designed with human survival in mind. By the time the air war over Europe reached its climax in 1944 and 1945, the lessons written in frozen flesh had been absorbed into doctrine and design. Crews still faced flak, fighters, and mechanical failure, but they were no longer routinely crippled by their own environment. The transformation did not come from a single invention or a single decision. It emerged from painful accumulation of evidence, gathered one injury at a time, one mission at a time. Every frostbitten hand was a data point. Every grounded veteran was a warning. Only when those warnings became impossible to ignore did the system respond. The early failures were not born of cruelty or indifference. They were born of assumption. Planners believed that if men were given enough layers, enough discipline, and enough courage, they could endure anything. That belief had deep roots in military culture. Throughout history, soldiers had been expected to adapt to their environment rather than demand that the environment be reshaped around them. The skies over Europe proved that belief wrong. At extreme altitude, nature imposed non-negotiable limits. Cold was not an adversary that could be intimidated or outlasted. It was a physical force that obeyed only physics. The men who flew those missions paid the price for that realization. They climbed into unpressurized aircraft before dawn, wrapped in layers of wool and wires, knowing that once airborne, there would be no relief. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Condensation turned to ice inside goggles. Fingers stiffened until even simple movements became deliberate acts of concentration. Fear was constant, but so was routine. They checked their equipment, climbed aboard, and took off because the war required it. Many did not return. Others returned altered in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. What makes the Frostbite crisis distinct within the broader history of World War II is that it was largely invisible. There were no dramatic photographs of cold injuries on the front pages of newspapers. No victory maps marked Frostbite as a conquered enemy. Injured men were quietly removed from flight status and replaced. The war moved on. Yet behind the scenes, the struggle against cold-shaped aircraft design, medical research, and operational doctrine as profoundly as any battle. The success of Colonel Grow's reforms demonstrated the power of interdisciplinary thinking. Medical officers did not merely treat injuries, they analyzed patterns, identified causes, and demanded engineering solutions. Engineers did not simply build aircraft, they adapted designs based on human limitations. Commanders learned that readiness was not just a matter of numbers and training hours, but of physiology and environment. These lessons became embedded in the institutional memory of the United States Air Force. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had achieved its strategic objective. German industrial capacity was crippled. Air superiority was secured. The daylight bombing campaign, once considered suicidal, became sustainable. The cost was enormous, but it was not as high as it might have been had the cold remained an unsolved problem. Thousands of airmen who might have been lost to frostbite remained in combat and lived to see the war end. The men who survived carried their memories forward. Decades later, veterans gathered at reunions, comparing scars, telling stories that younger generations struggled to imagine. They spoke of flak bursts like black flowers in the sky, of fighters diving out of the sun, of the deafening noise inside the bomber. And sometimes, quietly, they spoke of the cold. Of hands that never fully recovered sensation. Of feet that ached every winter. Of moments when they wondered whether freezing to death at 30,000 feet would be faster than burning on the way down. Those stories are reminders that victory is never achieved by strategy alone. It is achieved by human beings operating at the edge of endurance. The machines they use matter. The assumptions made about their limits matter even more. World War II forced militaries to confront those truths under the harshest possible conditions. The aircraft that followed bore the imprint of those lessons. Pressurization, climate control, remote weapon systems, and ergonomic design all trace part of their lineage to the bitter cold over Europe. Modern aircrews operate in environments that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors, protected not by layers of wool and wires, but by integrated systems designed to keep humans alive while machines do the work. That evolution was not inevitable. It was earned through failure. The Frostbite crisis also offers a broader lesson beyond aviation. In any complex system, human performance is constrained by biology. Training and motivation can push those constraints only so far. When systems are designed without regard for those limits, failure becomes inevitable. The air war over Europe demonstrated that reality in the most unforgiving way possible. Colonel Groh once remarked that medicine's role in war was not merely to heal, but to prevent harm by understanding how war itself injures the body. His work embodied that philosophy. He did not accept frostbite as an unavoidable cost of combat. He treated it as a solvable problem. In doing so, he changed the course of aerial warfare and saved lives he would never meet. As the last veterans of the 8th Air Force pass into history, their experiences risk fading into abstraction. Numbers replace faces. Statistics replace voices. Yet the cold they endured remains a tangible legacy. It shaped the machines that followed and the doctrines that govern them. It stands as a reminder that progress often begins not with triumph, but with recognition of failure. The men who flew into that cold did not see themselves as pioneers. They were simply doing their duty with the tools they had. History would later judge those tools inadequate, but it would also recognize the resilience of those who used them. In the end, the battle against frostbite was not won by endurance alone, but by learning, adaptation, and respect for the limits of the human body. That quiet victory, fought without headlines or medals, remains one of the most consequential lessons of the air war over Europe.